Welcome to industrialscripts.co.uk, home of the Insider Interviews, a series of Q&As with people currently working at various levels and in different areas of the British film industry. The interviews are absolutely exclusive to Industrial Scripts and can't be accessed anywhere else.
Sophie Mayer is Head of Development at Ealing Studios. Having overseen the slate since joining the company in 2004, she is credited as co-producer on St. Trinian's 2, The Legend of Fritton's Gold, and as associate producer on Dorian Gray, Easy Virtue and St. Trinian's. She also worked on the development of productions of Fade to Black, Alien Autopsy and I Want Candy. With over 12 years working in UK development, she was previously head of development for Mission Pictures, where she worked across a slate of projects, including Danny Boyle's Millions, and prior to that, worked in development at Intermedia and British Screen.
Okay, Soph, going back to the beginning, when did a career in film first come onto your radar, or when did you first begin possibly thinking about it seriously?
Well, I think I'm slightly unusual in that I didn't always dream of a career in film. I kind of fell into it. And in fact, I originally wanted to work in arts administration and had done a degree that sort of led me towards that and had some work experience and worked in an art gallery for a bit, and then found that the world didn't suit me. And I was very lucky. I heard about a job as an assistant at British Screen through a friend of a friend of a friend, and managed to wangle myself an interview and thought, yeah, film sounds really interesting. You know, it always seemed sort of a slightly unobtainable thing to work in, I think. I'd never kind of quite thought about it. I didn't really know about development as a thing or what those jobs would be. So I quickly went out and bought myself a copy of the BFI handbook and read up on the British film industry and had a bit about British Screen, luckily. So I sort of went in there a little bit prepared, at least, to have some, hopefully, half-intelligent questions and things that I could ask them about. And I think they quite liked the fact that I had a fair amount of work experience under my belt, so I knew about things like databases and just sort of practical stuff like that. But I didn't have any script reading experience.
How old were you at this point?
Well, I did a 4-year degree and took a year off beforehand, so I suppose I was sort of 22, maybe, something like that. And I think I was just very lucky. You know, I got the job and sort of learnt on the job a lot of the skills that perhaps people nowadays almost might need to have in order to get one of those sort of development assistant type jobs. You know, particularly things like reading and covering scripts was something that I kind of gradually got more involved in as I was there.
Do you feel that's a reflection of how it's got more competitive down the years, or?
To be honest, I just really don't know. You know, at the time I didn't know other people who were trying to get jobs in the industry. I suspect it's always been competitive, but, you know, who knows, maybe there's sort of more knowledge about film and development and, you know, how the sort of behind-the-scenes bit of the industry work now, so perhaps there are more people keen to get jobs in that area. You know, I just don't know, to be honest.
Yeah, there's certainly far more information on blogs and various other websites about how you go about getting into the industry.
Yeah, and what those jobs are.
Yeah.
You know, I know that there was a skill set website, which I'm sure is still up there somewhere, where it took lots of different roles in the industry and interviewed people who did them, and so that you could get a sense of, you know, what a development executive is. And, you know, that's not something I'd ever heard of. And still I find now that being a development person is something that you have to explain to a lot of civilians, as it were, because I think they most often assume that it's something to do with fundraising or, I don't know, construction development or something. You know, it doesn't really mean anything outside the film world.
Yeah. So, how long were you at British Screen, and looking back on that period, what are the sort of key things that you learnt during that phase, or that you can take out of that phase?
Yeah, I think I learnt an incredible amount. I was there for around about 3 years, and it started very much as a sort of pure admin job, I suppose. There was a lot of photocopying and a lot of faxing, which seems very anachronistic now, and a lot of audio typing as well, because we got an incredible number of submissions there. It was completely open access. You didn't have to have an agent or a company or anything to send in material. So we got a fair amount of scripts written in green ink and, you know, a little eccentric. But everyone had to have a reply, and everyone got an individualised reply as well.
Wow.
So coverage was done on everything.
That's staggering to think about that in today's context.
Yeah,
isn't it?
I suppose
It's
so.
amazing.
Yeah, I think that they found ways, at the Film Council as it was, and now at the BFI, I think they have a slightly more filtering way of kind of dealing with material. But so everything was covered, and so we had to send out, and again, hard copy letters because email didn't really exist then. So I did a lot of audio typing and mail merge and stuffing envelopes and all that sort of business.
The mind literally boggles about
and
that.
so, that was somewhat mind-numbing, but interesting in a sense, partly to get an overview of the British industry because, as well as the scripts written on green ink, there were obviously a lot of fantastic scripts coming through the door, and representing a whole range of British writing, from very new writing to really quite established writers, because producers also came to us for what were called development loans at the time. In order to take their projects through development. So it was a great place to get a sense of who was who in the industry, who were the writers that people were interested in, who were the different producers, what films they were making, and what kind of material they were developing. And one of the most fantastic things about it as well was that the way the system worked there at the time was I worked for Emma Bukowski, who was the head of development, and Jenny Borgars, who was development executive. And they ran different elements of the process there. So there were development loans and screenplay loans, which were a smaller amount of money for younger writers. And when they found projects that they really wanted to take on, they had to take them to what was called a development panel. And that had some really fantastically knowledgeable people on it. People like Colin Young and Robert Jones and... writer whose name escaped me, Jack Rosenthal, and so these were really knowledgeable industry figures that was fascinating to listen as they would assess the material that we were proposing to take on for development and give criticism about why they thought it was a good idea or not. So I think I learned actually an incredible amount, partly just listening to them talk about material. And then as the job went on, I got more involved in covering material, first of all for the production funds, so for Simon Perry and for the executives who work with him over there. And I would have to read perhaps 2 or 3 scripts a week and go to their meeting and talk about them and write coverage. And so that was good training to do that. And then as I got further on in my time there, I started to be let into the development meeting, so shadowing Emma and Jenny a bit more and contributing to notes and sitting in on meetings. I think
Sounds almost like a dream development apprenticeship in some ways, and it was paid and live.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that I learnt, both Emma and Jenny are, fantastic at what they do and extremely experienced. So to work alongside 2 people like that, to be able to learn from them, but also seeing what was going on with the production fund as well, getting a sense of how films finance was put together, working alongside Cameron McCracken, who was our head of business affairs at that point. It just gave me a real kind of overview of how things fitted together and were taken through the process.
Sure. You moved on to Intermedia, which back then was a huge company.
Yeah.
Maybe for people who are newer to the industry, Intermedia was almost sort of working title at its peak size, I believe. I think it employed almost 60 people at one point.
I think we had about 45 people in London and about 15 to 20 in America. And it floated on the stock market in Cannes a few months after I arrived with a huge valuation. And so, it was a big, very active company with a lot of deals with different producers and with actor-led companies, and a kind of a large appetite for trying to find bigger commercial projects.
Sure, and a very international kind of presence. Did you think that moving away from public funding bodies have a reputational perception of being quite cosy environments? Did you find that moving away from that kind of environment into this quite high-powered environment quite challenging, or?
Yeah, no, I did, absolutely. I mean, I don't think I was in any way high-powered within it, but I was a very small cog in that wheel. But yes, I did find it very challenging. I think that British Screen was a very nurturing, friendly, I sort of felt like they were family. It was a small company. There were about 15 of us, I think, at the time. And going into Intermedia did feel like a bit of a sort of culture shock, I suppose. and I think I struggled with it a bit first, and the pace of working, the expectation, the slightly intimidating nature of some of the other colleagues, and particularly the guys who ran the company, who are fantastic at what they do, but expect a lot and expect things quickly and expect things to be done absolutely right. And just that thing of working with LA, I hadn't done that before, and one of the key aspects of my job was to be a liaison person between our office and the LA office. And I had my kind of opposite number over there, and we had to make sure that our weekly project status document was absolutely correct and absolutely up to date. And that had at least 50 projects on it, I think, and with every detail about what was going on and who the personnel were involved and all of that. And a lot about covering material and sending material back and forth. So again, it seems extraordinary now, but there was a lot of faxing overnight of scripts, and just trying to make sure that the right people within the company read those and they were covered in the right way, and we were ready to talk about them at the appropriate times according to whatever suited LA. But I suppose the other big thing that was a difference was the kinds of material I was reading and the way of assessing it. So rather than it being pretty much purely UK writing and a lot of new writing, where you're absolutely looking to find good potential, good texture, an interesting voice, something distinctive and original and fresh, and something that's going to kind of hopefully find a writer who's going to grow and become something over the years. This was very much more an acquisitions, I suppose, type mentality, where you're looking for projects that are more fully formed, and particularly reading a lot of American scripts, which I think was a big education for me, to suddenly be exposed to that kind of material that's a bit closer to production, perhaps packaged at a bigger budget level and kind of cast and director, and see how efficient a lot of that writing can be, and great a lot of that writing can be, in terms of really having a strong sense of genre and narrative drive and a clear place in terms of sort of market and audience. And as we were assessing material, and the challenge I found was finding big and commercial enough projects out of the UK that really suited what Intermedia as a company wanted, but particularly as the sales emphasis started to move more towards LA, finding things that suited what their criteria was really challenging. And I remember particularly one of our head of sales in America used to say things like, but why is anyone in South Korea going to want to see this story? And that's kind of always stuck with me as like, actually a very valid question. You need to be sure when you're making a film that you think you've got a story that's universal enough, it's going to travel. But obviously a lot depends on budget and what scale you make it at, but we were trying to find bigger films that really would work in the international market.
Sure. You've been a head of development now for a number of years. Can you give us a sort of insight into a typical week for you, if there is such a thing, if one exists? I guess how your time is split maybe on it.
Yeah, I suppose. I think it's, as you say, it's probably quite tricky to really work out what a typical week is, because a lot depends on what's going on at that time, whether you're in production or not. But I suppose my time roughly breaks up. Obviously spend a fair amount of time in script meetings with writers. So, if a draft comes in, you read the draft, you work out, what you think, you talk to your colleagues about what you think, you have the meeting with the writer and give them notes, and then often you'll be writing up notes after that meeting. We have a weekly meeting where we go through the slate and discuss what's happening on each project, what needs to happen and who needs to be doing what, and working out whether it's who's the next actor we're going to, who's the next director we're going to, who do we need to chase up. And then obviously it's a fair amount of time reading scripts. I would say on average now I probably read about 4 or 5 scripts a week, which is probably a lot less than I used to, actually. I think in the sense that almost as you move up, you perhaps read fewer scripts, or you read a sort of, a more selected range of scripts. But again, that depends. There may be a moment where if I'm looking for a writer on a project, I'm reading a lot more writing samples than I am at other times. So at that point I might be reading 10 or 15 scripts a week. It just depends what's going on. And if I'm in production, if we're in production, then again it slightly depends on what the project is. Some things seem to need more script work and development attention, as it were, through that process. So something like both the St. Trinian's films, the script writing process was very active all the way through the making of those films, whereas something like Dorian Gray, we were tweaking and adjusting the script according to production necessities, or something perhaps you'd seen a strength in a certain actor that you wanted to reflect more and give more to in the script. But it was all minor tweaks, really, compared to some of the other projects we worked on.
Sure. Moving on to just writers in general, what do you enjoy most about working with writers?
It's a hard thing to answer. I mean, I guess working with writers is the bit of my job that I love the most. And I think it's partly that I really enjoy talking about story, talking about characters, and the mental challenge of thinking, how can you make this, or help the writer make this story communicate in the best possible way? How can you make it as emotional and exciting and the stakes as high as they possibly could be? I think that what's a joy is when you're working with a writer who embraces that process and likes and can come up with fantastic ideas that you could never have thought of yourself, and ingenious solutions to a problem, and really insightful, truthful, emotional points of view on a character. And I have huge respect for what writers do. I know absolutely it's not something I can do myself. I hope that I can help them in their process, but the thought of sitting down with a blank page somewhat terrifies me, and I think it's amazing what they do.
Sure. And in terms of what you find most frustrating about working with writers, are there specific things that...
I think what can be challenging is keeping the faith going through multiple drafts when things perhaps aren't quite progressing in the way that everyone had hoped, or sometimes drafts may take a slightly sideways step or a diagonal step, and you have to kind of keep the faith that there is a great story and a great film at the end of this process, and sometimes it just takes a long time. And development is notoriously time consuming, and I kind of think that sometimes it just needs to take that amount of time. Sometimes you need to go up some blind alleys, and sometimes everyone needs a bit of a break away from something so that they can come back to it fresh and see the problems that perhaps they were a bit too close to be able to recognise previously. So I'm a little suspicious when there are people who come along with sort of grand notions of how to speed up the development process, because I think that sometimes we all need a bit of headspace to think about something and to really get to the best version of what a character or story should be about.
Okay. A common criticism of UK writers is that their scripts are often quite televisual in feel and scope. That I guess it's almost a cliched criticism. It's thrown around that much. Do you concur with that, I guess, or do you think our writers sometimes do lack that ambition? Or, I mean, quite often the counter argument from these writers is that they're just being realistic to the budget levels we work with.
It's interesting though, isn't it? I suppose to an extent I might ask you to define, if you could, like what people mean when they say televisual. Do you think they're talking mostly about scale and budget, or are they talking about some other quality within the storytelling? Because I think one thinks of and there's a lot of fabulous television writing around at the moment, and I think actually in many ways British film in particular has to sort of raise its game in order to get people up off the sofa, because there's so much fab telly that they can see. But I guess what I think of as televisual writing is more to do with things that are perhaps a little bit more dialogue driven rather than visually driven. But for me, the most defining quality, I suppose, is about scale of emotion and scale of stakes within the story. So just because something is written and designed to be made at a certain budget level doesn't, I think, inherently make it television. Because I think, some of the really fabulous films that have been made over the last few years, take something like Monsters or London to Brighton, Tyrannosaur, all relatively low budget, and I'm sure if you compared those budgets to some of the kind of, high-scale television that's around, probably much, much lower than that per hour. But it's to do with a story that is absolutely gripping and exciting and feels big in some way. And I suppose...
So it's almost that invisible quality in a way that... I mean, because Tyrannosaur, to take that example, isn't... I mean, I guess the pitch isn't inherently cinematic, but it does have that bit extra you're talking about.
I think it's partly to do with, there were sort of fantastic performances in that film, but also the stakes and the emotion that's going on in that story and the things that happen, even though it's done in a sort of low-key way, it takes you to a place where both those characters are in a completely extraordinary, absolutely once-in-a-lifetime situation. And I think that's what makes it, feel like a film. And something like Monsters has a huge, bold, conceptual leap at the heart of it. But, television is chasing on our heels in terms of these things, and there's a lot more there in terms of emotion, stakes, and conceptual leaps in television, I think, than there used to be 10, 15 years ago. So I guess one of the things I have found over the years with British writing is there's sometimes a tendency to shy away from the emotion of something. So, I sometimes find with scripts, or used to find more, that a writer would almost cut out of a scene almost just at the moment when things could get really interesting, and you want to kind of actually get into the guts of what is really at stake and how these characters really being kind of pushed to the limits in terms of their emotional experience.
Okay. Danny Stack, who runs Tony Jordan's Red Planet Screenwriting Prize, which is obviously one of the bigger screenwriting competitions in the UK, is of the opinion that general standards of screenwriting, that's, I guess, pros and people out there who are looking to get into the industry, newer writers, that the standards have improved significantly in the last 10 years. Do you agree with that?
I think I probably do, actually. I mean, it's slightly hard to tell, as I say, because I think as you start to work at a more senior level of development, perhaps you're not reading quite the same range of new writing as you are at the beginning of your career. But I do think that there has been noticeably a sort of more exciting, more cinematic range of writing around. I wonder if it's something to do with people embracing genre a bit more. It feels like about sort of 10, maybe even 15 years ago, people started to sort of think about it a bit more. There were more sort of seminars. I know the Film Council did a big push with their 25 words or less scheme, and there was a regime there at a certain point that were particularly interested in genre as something to think about. And I think whether a writer is working specifically within a genre, be it thriller, horror, comedy, whatever it may be, or not, in a way just having that awareness of thinking about where things sit and fit, even if you're consciously going, what I want to write is a fairly straightforward drama, then at least maybe that's more of a conscious decision now, and there's more of an awareness of who the audience is for that project. Because I think there have been a lot of fantastically successful British films over the last few years, and they've all known who their audience was, and they've all been done in a very smart way to kind of hit the beats and make sure that they deliver emotionally, or deliver the laughs, or deliver the scares, or thrills, or whatever it may be. And I think perhaps writers have become more aware that they need to think about those sorts of things, and perhaps also there's been more, as we were saying earlier, there are more blogs nowadays and screenwriters festivals and ways of writers being able to sort of learn their craft other than just having to kind of go on the Robert McKee course or buy a Sid Field book, all of which I think can be useful, but I think also can be a bit hobbling in a way, because you can sort of almost get over obsessed with thinking about fitting those structural models. But I know that some of the writers we've worked with who started off as newer writers, they spoke at a screenwriters festival recently, and I listened to them, and they said that actually reading blogs by other screenwriters and seeing how other writers had dealt with technical and script problems actually was incredibly useful to them. And again, I think it just opens up this bigger, as it were, global conversation about what is good writing and who's the audience for something, and how can you really, deliver the best and most emotional and funny or scary or whatever it is that you can.
Sure. Can you tell us about some ways you've discovered or unearthed writers down the years, or moments where you got particularly excited about a writer or a project?
I guess I mean, to give you a couple of examples of writers, that we've worked with or are working with fairly recently here. So Toby Finlay, for example, who rewrote Dorian Gray for us. I first read a script of his called Patience, which I think had been originally developed at Working Title, perhaps as one of their sort of lower budgeted schemes. And I mean, fairly conventional way of discovering him, I suppose. The script was sent to us as a writing sample from his agent. It was read by a young guy who was working with me here at the time, who then passed it on to me to read. And although we had really been looking at much bigger names initially to rewrite Dorian Gray for us, and had been thinking about sort of much more established figures, there was something about the quality of Toby's writing that was just very exciting and really visceral and dark and interesting and clever. And I met him, and he's quite, I'm sure you know Toby, he's quite a character, and I've great fondness for him, but and there was something about him as a personality as well, and the combination of that with Dorian Gray that just seemed like an absolutely natural fit. And so I talked to Barnaby about him slightly nervously, because I sort of thought what Barnaby really wants is an established writer here. And Barnaby said, okay, well, look, why not, I'll read a sample and we'll meet him. And what Toby did, which was very smart, was when we sent him Dorian Gray, he wrote about 2 or 3 pages of very articulate, very clever notes about what he thought the script needed and where it should sit. And I think he called it something like it should be a Victorian American Psycho or something. And but he's a very, very smart guy, Toby, and that came across in the notes. And I think Barnaby was particularly impressed by that, and by the kind of the quality of the writing in Patience, even though it was
did
a
you
very
request
different
those
genre.
notes? Sorry, or
No,
did he do them off his own
To
back?
be honest, actually, I can't quite remember now. It's a while ago. I think perhaps what happened was that he and I had a meeting and talked about it first of all, just the two of us. And I perhaps said to him, it'd be really useful if you could just get some of this down on paper, just so that then I can use that as a way of sort of introducing you partly to Barnaby. And but I don't think I was expecting anything quite as kind of fully formed and well articulated as they were, and it was very persuasive. And he then ended up doing a really fabulous job on the script. And there was certainly a period of development to get it right. And one of the challenges of that story, partly because you've got that time break in the middle, is how you stay emotionally connected to Dorian. And we made the choice that we wanted it to be Dorian's story as an emotional point of view. There are different ways you could do that. You could go via the character of Henry, but we wanted it to be the kind of, Victorian rock star journey, as it were, who goes into the heart of darkness. And so that took quite a lot of time to kind of hone and get that right. But it was, really fantastic experience working with Toby, so that was great. And the other person, I suppose, if you want another example, is a guy called Peter Suter, who is doing Doctor in the House for us at the moment. Again, we were sent his sample script. In fact, I think what happened was we knew we were looking for a writer on Doctor in the House, so we decided to go around and talk to the agents and say, this is what we want it to be. We've done it before with St. Trinians. This is a different tone, clearly, but we want to, reinvent and reimagine this. Who have you got? And again, had a list of, quite experienced writers as our wish list, as I think a lot of people start out with. And we were sent Peter's script. His agent pitched us him as the new Richard Curtis, and I thought it was fantastic. Yeah. And I thought his sample script was really great. It was very funny and truthful and emotional, and had some very clever writing in it. And we met a few writers on the project, but Peter again came up with a slightly sort of inventive conceptual leap to get you into the story. And even though he was someone who's very, very new to screenwriting, so with both Toby and Peter, the samples I read were the first ever scripts I believe they'd written, or certainly the ones that they'd shown the world anyway. For someone who's so new to writing, he was very smart about thinking about how you remake this into a movie, partly because medical drama is so well represented on television that you really need to sort of think about, okay, what's the thing that's going to make people want to go out and see this? And so, we ended up hiring to do the job. And again, he's been a pleasure to work with.
Excellent. Moving on to, I guess, the industry or a career as a script development person. Something that interests me is that it's, I think, quite commonly acknowledged that script development is one of the most competitive job markets in an already fiercely competitive industry. Can you put your finger on why that is?
That's an interesting question. I wonder if it's partly it's a very creative job, and I think people see it as a creative job, and so that attracts people. I think that it's perceived anyway as perhaps one of the more sort of secure jobs in the industry, and a job where you're kind of you're in-house, hopefully at a company, you're in an office, you're not having to sit in a freezing cold trailer surrounded by mud, and you're not a freelancer doing it on a film by film basis mostly. And I think that people enjoy reading screenplays. Anyone can get hold of screenplays and sort of start to have an opinion about them and think about them, and people like to think that they can be part of a process that is helping the film become the best version it can be.
Okay. People, I think, often cite that middle stage of a development career as the trickiest to negotiate, in that although there's quite a healthy amount of assistant jobs, and there's definitely a healthy amount of script reader jobs, and you'd also argue there's a reasonable volume of big your kind of type head of development jobs, but there is a kind of absence of development coordinator or development executive jobs, and that mid-level just doesn't seem to exist so much here in the UK. Do you agree with that perception, and how did you go about tackling that stage, or did you kind of bypass it in a way?
No, I wouldn't say I bypassed it at all. I think I guess it is a tricky area, and certainly the people who I meet who want advice or are sort of looking to work their way through, that's one of the things we always seem to end up talking about, because it's how you make that leap through. And there are, I suppose, relatively few of those jobs. I think partly because the industry is just smaller here. There aren't so many companies of a certain scale where they have that many layers of people in development. And looking around the people I know who've done it, they often seem to have leapfrogged through junior development or sort of in-house reader type jobs at places like maybe the BBC or the Film Council or Working Title or Big Talk, or one of the other companies that have got sort of a proper scale in terms of the departments that they have there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the way I did it, I suppose, was through Intermedia. I was hired there as development executive, although probably the job was a bit more acquisitions essentially. And then when I moved on to Mission Pictures, I was also hired as development executive there. Started getting involved a bit more with actual sort of proper development work, but mostly working with new writers, and during my time there was then promoted to head of development. So I think I was lucky enough to find companies that did have that layer and work my way through. And I think you need that as well. If where you're aiming to get to is head of development, then you have to find one of those jobs, to be they few and far between.
Sure. I think there's this slightly unhealthy culture or perception of anyone being able to deliver feedback or work with writers and generally do development. As someone who's an absolute development specialist, in that you're not necessarily looking to produce, you've said you're not looking to write, not a director, does that irritate you? And why do you think that culture exists?
Yeah, I suppose maybe it does irritate me a bit. I think the culture probably exists because everyone can read. Everyone, can read scripts and have an opinion about them. Everyone watches films and have an opinion about them. And it's a bit like that thing of, everybody thinks they've got a sense of humour. And of course everyone's opinions are valid, absolutely. But whether those opinions can be or know how to be expressed in such a way that can help a writer hone their story to be the best version it can be, I think is the area of question, and an area where I think to a certain amount of talent, but particularly experience, can help you gain the tools to be able to,
Well, I was going to say knowledge plays a huge part, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, of course it does. But I think it's a tricky area, because I think on the one hand, you always want lots of opinions on things, and opinions of people, who are more junior or who are often younger are always valid and always important to hear, often because they may be more representative of the audience that you're trying to develop a project for than perhaps the more senior people in the company. But at the same time, I do think that there's a certain level of experience and knowledge and natural ability, I suppose, that is helpful to be working with writers. And I sometimes wonder whether just the natural way of things, which is that the more junior people in development end up working with the newer writers, in many ways that's mutually beneficial, and you learn from each other, much as I did when I first started working directly with writers. But at the same time, if they were working with a more experienced development person, perhaps they would navigate their way through the development process a little more easily. I don't know, it's one of those tricky areas.
Sure. It strikes me that there are sort of three core skills or qualities to being a development person. Number one would be the taste and the ability to identify promising ideas, writers or material. Mm-hmm. The second would be the ability to script edit and almost be that coach-like figure who extracts the best performance from their writer. And the third would be writer knowledge, contacts, agent contacts, industry contacts, and general, I guess, information coming into you. Now, to the outside world, one would assume the first two are the most important facets to the job. But do you agree that people tend to get hired more based on the latter? I mean, for example, another exec once said to me, your writer knowledge is your collateral as a development person. That is what you have over others.
Yes, I suppose so. I think that's a very tricky question, because I'm not sure that you can really separate those three things out exactly, because I kind of think, and in my experience, you only get to the point of having those relationships with writers and agents and other industry figures through showing ability in the first two categories, in a way. So it's through showing that you have taste that people respect and ability to be able to get on and work with writers and help them get through the process in a useful and good way, that you start to hopefully build up a reputation that means that you then those relationships endure. So if there are certain writers who I met and expressed enthusiasm about their writing very early in their careers, who are now very well established senior writers, and I'm sure that the reason that I have an ongoing relationship with them is because I spoke to them at an early stage and hopefully had the ability to sort of spot the potential in their writing at an early stage. And I think, again, with agents, it's about being able to talk, hopefully intelligently about material and give responses, even if those are negative responses, where, it helps them in their job providing feedback to the writers about, the response on the submission. So, yes, I think, of course, one's, as it were, address book is very important in one's ability to be able to do the job and move projects forward, find the right writers for projects. But I just don't really believe that you'd ever have quality number three on its own without the first two.
Okay. Do you feel that one of the limitations of our industry here in the UK, compared with, say, the US, and I'm not saying that they're not guilty of this as well, is our inability to sort of cover material properly? And by that I mean, more often than not, it's a very fresh-faced graduate or sometimes even intern who's the first line on that script filter. And these people, however well educated they are or intuitive they are, they're not really equipped to be making potentially multi-million-pound verdicts on projects. And material slips through the net, or sometimes material that shouldn't be promoted gets promoted. Do you think that's one of our, failures or key failings?
It's an interesting question, and I have noticed recently that it does seem that there are a fair few companies that are using development interns as their sort of first line of coverage, as it were, and almost everything gets read in that way first. And hopefully you, as you say, you find people who are very bright and have good instincts. But I think that most people, when they're starting out, need to learn a bit about how you define where something's going to sit in terms of the market and audience, which are always key questions. Obviously, you need to work out, does a story work on its own terms? Is it emotional? Does it hit the beats that it needs to? Does it work within its own terms in whatever genre it has ambitions for? But you always need to sort of take that step back and go, okay, well, what are the comparable projects? Who's going to want to see this? Does it feel like something that is financeable, that will be able to be made for an appropriate budget level according to the kind of scale of the story and the audience it's aiming at? And I think that those are things that you sort of need to learn about, and partly just through experience and reading lots of material, but also having conversations with people who have more experience in those areas than you do. How much that limits us as an industry, I don't quite know. I mean, I think, it's certainly an interesting question, and I find when I'm working with newer readers, or when we've had interns who do occasional bits of coverage for us, that the tendency tends to either be to over-recommend or to under-recommend when it comes to something where perhaps there's great potential in the writer but less potential in the material itself, or perhaps it's a great concept but the writer hasn't managed to execute it in a well way, and perhaps there's a way with a new writer it might be able to turn into something really exciting. And when I've been trying out readers or potential assistants recently, that's one of the things I've done, is sent out scripts where I quite specifically chose 2 scripts where they had, as it were, that combination of qualities, to see whether people recognised potential, even if it wasn't quite there on the page yet. And whether that limits us in industry, quite possibly. I don't know, but I sort of think, I do believe that good material rises to the top, and whenever I talk to writers at the Screenwriters Festival to whatever, I do say, if your writing is good enough, you will get there. Obviously, there is the challenge of getting the right person somewhere to read it in the first place, which can be tricky and a bit of a catch-22 situation, I think, for certain writers, but if there's
even
a good...
then, if you send it to enough people and
exactly,
it's good enough, it will get there.
Yeah, absolutely, I really do think that.
Yeah. Okay, Tim Bevan once said that development is still the most challenging area of the filmmaking process, and it strikes me that it's sort of this unique area of the industry, and that it's this bizarre conflation of different elements. It's the most important part. I would say that. You probably would say that.
Absolutely.
But it does have the greatest impact on the film's fortunes, along with possibly casting, I would say.
Yeah.
But
and choice of director, obviously. I mean, that's the funny thing about film, is that you need the stars to align in all sorts of different elements of the putting together of the film in order for it to really, really be successful. Obviously, you have to have a great script to start with. You can't make a great film from a bad script, but...
Well, that's the thing. The other two can't exist without the great core story.
Yeah, of course, yeah. If you've got a great
script...
Whereas the
inverse isn't true.
Yeah, and if you've got a great script, then hopefully that helps you towards great director and great casting.
Yeah. But also, it's the riskiest financially. People often don't realise that, I think, but it is the riskiest
money in
the film industry. And so you kind of have less control over it than you do in other areas. And what I mean by that is, to take an extreme example, if you hire Brad Pitt to star in your movie, irrespective of the quality of the movie, it's going to make a certain amount of money. Or if you hired a Roger Deakins to shoot it, it's almost 100% guaranteed to look great, unless you've given him absolutely no money. But that's not the case with the writers. I mean, to take the Johnny Depp movie recently, The Tourist, that had 2 Oscar winners working on it. The writer of The Usual Suspects, and it had Julian Fellows, who you've worked with before, and to be polite, the story wasn't terrific. So do you concur with Bevan on that? And also after more than 10 years working in it, I guess, what are your general views on this weirdest of areas?
I would, Tim Bevan does know what he's talking about, and so, I think it is a curious and challenging area, development, and you're right, just because you might hire a big name, expensive writer doesn't guarantee that you will successfully, get your way through that process. I think that it does help, as it were, if you're working with someone who is clearly extremely talented and has a level of experience and sort of knowledge and confidence about what they want their story to be. So, I think there is an argument that you take some of the risk out of the process if you go for bigger name writers. But obviously you then have to have the resources to be able to do that, and Working Title really has way more development resources than pretty much any other company in the UK, so they can afford to really keep going on projects and hire big name writers on them when they need to. But it's one of those things where you can never quite tell what's going to come out of something, and you hope that as the sort of team around the writer, you help guide them through the process in a way that makes it as painless as possible or as quick as possible, but you never quite know what are going to be the things that may trip you up along the way. And it's a challenging area. As I said earlier, I think half the problem sometimes is just keeping the faith and just making sure that you really, all of you as a team, believe in the final project that you're aiming for. And I think most crucially that you all establish a way of being able to talk about it so that you're absolutely clear that you're all thinking of the same film. Because I think that that's one of the key areas where development most often goes wrong, is when somehow everybody sitting in the room, they're not quite listening to each other, and each of them imagines that everyone else is thinking of the same film that's in their head, when actually, I think particularly in the area of tone, which can be absolutely crucial, particularly in comedy, that they're just imagining a slightly different film. So people can be giving just ever so slightly conflicting notes to the writer, or the writer can not quite be listening to the producer, or the producer can not quite be listening to what the writer has or has not understood about the notes, or as I was saying, they're sort of thinking of a slightly different version of what the film is. And that's, I think, when the development process gets most challenging, and certainly in my experience on the projects I've worked on, that's when things have gone slightly wrong, is because one person's imagining more of a true black comedy, somebody's imagining something else that's a bit more of a historical drama, or whatever it may be. And I see one of the key aspects of my role as to be someone who facilitates that communication between the team. So I'm making sure that the writer is clear, that they know what the notes are, and that they've clearly understood perhaps what Barnaby's saying, and vice versa, that each side has clearly kind of understood what the other is saying. And I suppose sometimes I see my role with the writers being somewhat a combination of a bully and a cheerleader, in that I have to go, rah, rah, you're fantastic, you can do it, but it's got to be better, go back and do it again. So that's how I see it.
Okay. You've now assessed literally, I would think, thousands of screenplays. Mm-hmm. This is a very difficult question, but if you had to identify one thing, I guess you've learned about the form or the medium of a screenplay and what it needs above all other things to succeed or impress people, what would that be?
Oh, that is a very tricky question. I suppose if I had to boil it down to one thing, it might be, does it make you care? So, which is in a way a sort of overarching concept that can take in a number of other subcategories, as it were. But I think you have to care about the story, you have to care about what's going to happen next, so that you want to keep watching or you keep turning the page. You have to care about your characters, you have to emotionally invest in them and want to sort of follow them on this journey and care about what the outcome may or may not be for them. And I think related to that, I often ask the script, whose story is it and what's the point of view, and has the audience really got a representative in this film that they can really invest in and go on this journey with. And then, do you care also speaks to what we were talking about earlier in terms of scale of emotion and stakes in the story. If the stakes are really high and you really care about this character, then you'll want to keep watching. So something, to give you an example of film, not that long ago, Tell No One, the French thriller, I just thought was fantastic. And you absolutely cared, you felt for this guy, you were desperate to want to know what was going to happen next. And I hadn't seen a film for a long time that really kind of gripped me in the way that one did.
I guess it's the whole, we quite often use the Superbad example. Mm-hmm. Even though, the stakes on the surface level are not obviously high, and it's just three nerds trying to get hold of some beer in order to impress some girls.
Yeah.
Because you care so much about the characters, you're thoroughly invested in the overall story. So the stakes don't have to be on the surface sky high, just as long as they work within the context of the world and the arena in which they take place.
And if in a way, for that character, it feels like the most important thing that's happening in their life at that moment.
Yeah, which it is.
Whether it's about, Harold and Kumar have to get to White Castle, or, these guys have to get the beer.
Or it's the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, exactly. That it's, you have to genuinely believe that person is completely invested in whatever this quest or task or however you want to define it is.
Okay, so quick fire round.
Okay.
Your favourite ever film? Or if you want, you can say a top 3.
Well, okay, I think it would be toss up somewhere between Matter of Life and Death and Third Man.
Okay. Best script you ever read?
I read a draft of the Charlie Kaufman movie, which I think ended up being called Adaptation, had a different title when I read it, but it was just so clever.
Okay. Your favourite screenwriter?
Tricky. Certainly, I always really enjoy reading Frank Cottrell-Boyce's scripts. They have a huge warmth about them.
Okay. Favourite screenplay of a film ever made?
Oh, God. Tricky. Maybe I'd have to go back to The Third Man again. Am I allowed that one? Same answer for 2.
Your favourite ever director?
Again, difficult, but I think Scorsese would have to be up there.
Okay.
Or possibly Billy Wilder, actually.
Good choices. Favourite performance by an actor?
That is a very difficult one. Can I just give you something recent-ish that I enjoyed? I loved Meryl Streep in Devil Wears Prada.
Okay. Your favourite TV show, or you can say a top 3 here of the recent American golden age of TV?
Well, that is tricky. I think certainly have to include Sopranos. Probably for me be Sopranos, West Wing and Battlestar Galactica, if I'm allowed 3.
That is geeky.
I know, secret
You're a
sci-fi
geek.
nerd.
Michael Mann or Martin Scorsese?
Well, I did say Scorsese earlier, didn't I? But can I have both?
No.
All right then, Scorsese.
Shane Meadows or Ken Loach?
Ken Loach.
Pacino or De Niro?
Pacino, I think.
Why?
I find his performances a little softer, warmer and more accessible, I suppose. But, De Niro is a god as well, so
Okay.
tough one.
Carey Mulligan or Emma Watson?
Carey Mulligan.
Last film you saw?
Probably The Hunger Games.
Okay. Last film you loathed?
Gosh, I really can't think of anything off the top of my head. Can I pass on that one?
You're going to have to. Last film you loved?
Last film I loved. Well, a film I watched again recently that I loved was Monster.
Okay.
Monsters, it's called, yeah.
Monster, the Charlize Theron, or Monsters?
Monsters, the Brit film.
Right, okay. Your film Guilty Pleasure, that movie that's a little bit embarrassing maybe that you think
I've probably
is great
got
or love.
2. I don't know if I'd call them, I don't know, embarrassing, but Castaway, because I somehow always like to imagine myself marooned on a desert island, and The Day After Tomorrow, because I just kind of like disaster movies as well.
Okay.
Perhaps imagining myself how I would deal with that.
There you go, writers.
snow.
There's your cue. Disaster movies, Threeling Studios.
Yeah, not sure that Barnaby shares that, I have to say. But,
Teenage movie crushes. Who did you fancy when you were...
well, I mean,
when
I
you
was
were
a
young?
kind of John Hughes girl, really. So, almost any of that gang who were in those sorts of films of that era.
Okay. And your dream dinner party guests, you can pick 5, up to 5.
Ooh, okay. Can I have Robert Downey Jr., George Clooney, Billy Wilder, so I'm allowed people who are no longer around, Marilyn Monroe. But yeah, that would be that gang. That would
Okay,
do.
that'd be good conversation.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you very much, Sophie Meyer.
thank you.